The sun of the distant planet rose like a slow-burning flame over the rust-colored hills, its light stretching across the strange sky that held a blue too deep to be true. It was the kind of world that looked untouched, ancient, and silent, except for the whispers of wind through dry trees that bent like old bones. Ray stood beside his small silver scout ship, brushing red dust from his sleeves. His boots sunk slightly into the loose ground, and every breath he took tasted of heat and copper. His mission was clear: observe, do not interfere, learn, and record the lives of the native species who were biologically compatible with humans, but socially primitive. He had seen their settlements from above, small clusters of domed huts, smoke rising in straight lines like signals to forgotten gods. He had expected to remain hidden, watching from the hills, but the universe had other plans. It started with the soft crunch of movement in the dry brush, a rustle that made Ray lift his head. His hand instinctively reached for his sidearm, though he kept it holstered. A figure emerged slowly from between the trees, small, light-footed, with skin that shimmered faintly in the sunlight. A girl, young, no more than 17 by human standards, with wide eyes the color of stormwater and hair braided in loops around her head. She saw him and stopped so suddenly that her bare feet sent a cloud of dust into the air, and without hesitation, without a single word, she dropped to her knees, her forehead lowered to the earth, her arms at her sides trembling. Ray was caught between confusion and caution. He stepped forward, slowly lowering his voice, trying not to frighten her. He said, "There is no need to kneel. It's all right. You don't have to do that." But she didn't look up, not at first. Her posture stayed frozen, as if she expected pain or punishment for even the smallest disobedience. He stood there for a while, not moving, hoping she would look at him, but the silence stretched longer than he liked, until he finally crouched beside her, trying to catch her gaze. She peeked up for a heartbeat, then quickly lowered her eyes again. He saw something in that single glance, not worship, not curiosity, but fear, deep-rooted and silent like the roots of the strange thorn trees on this world. Ray sighed. He didn't know her language yet, and the translator was still calibrating. He didn't want to scare her more, so he stepped back, giving her space. After a few moments, she rose, not all the way to her feet, just enough to turn and slip away, her movement graceful but swift, like a creature trained to disappear when seen. Next day she came again, this time standing a little farther away, not kneeling, not speaking, just watching him from the edge of the clearing. Ray let her be. He resumed his task, scanning soil samples and adjusting the solar panels on his ship's wings. He talked aloud, not to her exactly, but so she could hear simple phrases. "My name is Ray. This is a ship. I come from the sky. Do you understand?" She didn't reply, but her head tilted with each word, like she was storing every syllable in her mind. Over the next few days the pattern continued. She arrived at dawn or near sunset, always alone, always quiet. Sometimes she knelt, sometimes she didn't. Ray continued speaking slowly, teaching small words, pointing at objects and naming them. He smiled often, not because he expected her to smile back, but because it was the only human warmth he could offer. Then came the evening when she finally spoke, her voice soft as wind through reeds, her accent strange but her meaning clear. She said, "My name is Lyra." The sound of it was like water falling on stone. Ray smiled wider, pleased that she trusted him enough to speak. They sat across from each other, near a glowing heat lamp he had set outside the ship. Lyra's eyes flickered toward the soft hum of the ship, the blinking lights, the strange surface under her hands. She reached out once, almost touching it, then pulled back. Ray said, "You can touch it. It won't hurt you." Lyra shook her head, not from distrust of the ship, but from something else, something older. Later that night, as they sat in quiet again, Ray saw her shift position, slowly lowering herself into that same kneeling stance again. He felt a twist of discomfort inside him. He said it again, "You don't have to kneel." Lyra looked at him with wide, unblinking eyes and whispered only 5 words, not yet in perfect translation, but strong enough for him to feel their weight. "They will hurt me if not." Ray didn't respond right away. He looked into the fireless light between them and felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the air around them. Lyra was not afraid of him. She was afraid of the rules engraved into her bones. Rules taught with pain, rules she could not forget even when no one else was watching. The room. Next morning, Ray followed her trail through the brush, using the faint footprints left in the soil and the occasional broken twig. She had tried to hide her path, but not well enough. He moved like a shadow, pausing when the breeze picked up, moving again. When silence fell, he found her village nestled between two rocky hills, domes of woven fiber walls, lined with symbols that his translator couldn't yet decipher. He saw males walking upright, speaking loudly, while the females moved quietly, heads bowed, some carrying water, others tending to dull fires. He watched Lyra return to her place, one of the smaller huts built half into the earth. No one seemed to notice her absence, or maybe no one dared to question it. He saw a boy shout at a girl who dropped a bowl. The girl fell to her knees fast and stayed there until the boy left. The moment burned into Ray's memory. He went back to his ship and sat for a long time, staring at the distant mountains, thinking about what he had seen, thinking about how many more like Lyra lived under rules built to keep them small. His mission said observe only, record, and move on. But something had shifted in him, watching her kneel, watching her flinch, watching her speak those 5 quiet words. He knew then that this story was not about first contact or alien cultures or data logs. This was about a girl who had never been told she could stand Talon. He could not just walk away. Ray spent the next morning sitting outside his ship, watching the horizon where the alien sun rose without hurry, the sky shifting from deep blue to a soft orange that bathed the world in a gentle light. He kept his hands busy fixing a cracked sensor plate. Even though it didn't need fixing, his mind was heavy with the memory of the village and what he had seen there, the way the women moved, the way the girls carried weight on their shoulders that had nothing to do with the baskets they held, and everything to do with the fear that bent their backs. Lyra arrived later than usual, her steps slower than before, her eyes tired. She sat across from Ray without kneeling this time, but she sat in a way that still made her small, her shoulders curled and her hands folded in her lap. Ray greeted her the way he always did, speaking softly, using the words she had learned already, her name, his name, small things like skyship. Friend, she nodded but didn't smile. Her fingers picked at the edge of her woven sleeve, and her gaze stayed low. He wanted to ask questions, but knew he had to be patient. Her silence was not emptiness, it was filled with words. She was not yet ready to say so. He started instead by showing her things. He brought out a data tablet, projected a floating map of the planet, showed her where her village was marked in green and where his ship had landed in silver. Her eyes widened a little at the sight of the glowing image. She pointed slowly at a red line running between 2 hills and spoke a word the translator didn't know yet. He repeated it, and she smiled faintly for the first time that day. That small smile gave him hope. He opened another file showing images of Earth, not the cities, just the forests, rivers, mountains, oceans, things that might speak to her without needing translation. Her breath caught when she saw a picture of snow falling over trees. She leaned closer, almost whispering the word for cold, and then she said something else, a longer sentence. The translator worked slowly, but gave him enough to understand. She said, there is no snow in my world, but I would like to see it. Ray wanted to promise her that she would someday, that she could see mountains and oceans and run without fear through a field of falling snow, but he knew he couldn't promise anything yet. He only said maybe someday. Then he stood up, stretched his arms, and asked if she wanted to see the ship. Inside, her eyes went wide again, not in fear this time, but wonder. She hesitated, then nodded slowly. He led her up the ramp, one careful step at a time. She paused at the threshold, looking back once, then stepped forward. Inside, the light was soft, and even the air cooler. She touched the walls with her fingertips, eyes darting from screen to screen, as if the whole ship were alive. Ray showed her the basic things. The food dispenser, the sleeping pod, the interface panel. He let her press a button that opened a small cabinet, and she laughed softly, the sound like water over stones. It was the first real laugh he had heard from Hirsch. Asked what this was, and what that did, and he answered every question, simply letting her explore within safe bounds. When she reached the captain's chair and saw the stars through the front Screen. She stood completely still for a long time. Ray watched her closely, wondering what she was thinking. Her voice came low when she spoke again. She said, "Your world must be very free." Ray didn't answer right away. He thought about that word free and what it meant to someone like her, someone who had never been allowed to speak loudly or walk proudly or even lift her head in public. He said, "Maybe yes, maybe no, some parts are not, but we try to make it better." Then he looked at her and asked, "Do you want to be free?" Lyra nodded without hesitation, then looked down again and said, "I am not allowed to say that." Ray felt something twist inside him, not anger, not yet, but something close, something like helplessness mixed with fire. He said, "Here you can say it. No one will hurt you here. You can speak." She looked at him unsure. But when he nodded encouragingly, she lifted her chin a little and said, "I want to be free. I want to walk. I want to speak. I want to learn and not kneel again, ever, not even when they say I must." Her words struck like lightning, not because they were loud, but because they were true and raw and full of a pain that had no place in someone so young. Ray knew then this was no longer just a mission. This was something more. This was personal. The translator finished syncing that night, and he spent hours feeding it more data from her language notes, grammar, culture patterns, everything he had seen and recorded from the village. His reports to command became colder, more clinical, stripped of emotion, because emotion would get him pulled from the mission, and he wasn't ready to leave, not until he did something that mattered. He started teaching Lyra more every day, not just language, but science, basic mechanics, navigation, simple circuits and maps. He gave her a small screen device that could project images and play sounds, and she held it like treasure, using it late into the night before returning to her village. She never asked for more and never complained when lessons were hard. She just listened and tried and failed and tried again. One evening after a lesson, she asked him, "Why do you teach me?" And Ray answered, "Because you deserve to know things, because knowledge is a kind of strength, and you should have some of it. And also because you remind me of someone I knew long ago, someone brave but trapped in silence." She didn't ask more, but she sat beside him for a long time that night, without speaking, and it felt like something important passed between them. Not words, not promises, just understanding. The next time she came, she wore something different, a scarf around her shoulders instead of the tight collar the others wore. Her walk was straighter, her eyes more focused. When she greeted him, her voice held more certainty, as if she had discovered something inside herself that was waiting to wake. Ray saw the change and felt pride swelling in his chest, but he also felt the shadow of coming storms. He knew that change never came without pushback, and the way things were in her world, those who stood up were often pushed down harder. But Lyra had already started to rise, and he would not let her fall alone. The sun was sinking behind the jagged rocks when Lyra arrived again, but this time something in her steps felt different. Something in her eyes was no longer just curious or careful. Now there was focus. Her chin was a little higher, her hands no longer twisted nervously in her lap, and though her body still carried the memory of fear, it looked like a body slowly waking from a long sleep. Ray saw it the moment she appeared from the trees, her shadow long across the cracked ground. She held the small learning device tightly in one hand, and when she reached him, she spoke first, asking him about stars and distances and how many other worlds there were where girls did not have to bow. Her words came fast, sometimes stumbling, but always full of fire. He answered as best as he could, showing her diagrams on the tablet, teaching her the names of stars and the meaning of orbits, explaining how space stretched beyond imagination and how Earth had once been a place of pain too, but people had fought, changed, grown, learned to stand together. Not all at once, not perfectly, but enough to let some truth live. She listened with her whole body, eyes wide, absorbing every word, as if her mind was hungry. And Ray realized that maybe this was the first time in her life someone had told her she could learn anything, that her mind was not limited to chores or silence or obedience. Later, as night fell and the stars blinked into view, she told him more about her village, how the elders decided what was allowed, how girls were raised to never look up, how stories were told in whispers and laughter was only for boys, how her sister had once spoken out during a village gathering and had been taken away not by strangers, but by the very people who called themselves leaders. Protectors, guardians of tradition. Ray listened without interrupting every word like a piece of a puzzle, and the image forming in his mind was not just a cruel culture, but a prison made of belief and fear, so old that even the chains no longer looked like chains. They looked like law. They looked like Faithy asked her gently what happened to her sister. And Lyra lowered her eyes for a long time, then said they said she was broken. They took her to the far caves. No one comes back from there. I waited for her to return, but they told me she had no voice anymore, and girls without voices cannot stay. Ray felt something deep and cold in his chest, hearing that something older than anger and more powerful than pity, something close to grief. Not his own, but borrowed from her, a grief that shaped her every step and breath in silence. That night he went back into the ship and opened a private channel to command. He sent a report coded and short explaining the cultural situation, requesting limited permission for educational exchange, no direct interference, just guidance. But the reply came back fast and sharp: deny request, maintain observation report, only avoid altering native society. Stared at those words for a long time, then deleted the message and shut off the channel. He understood now that no one was coming to help her. No one was going to challenge the old laws. No one, but maybe him. Over the next days he began to plan quietly, methodically, teaching Lyra new things, showing her maps of ancient Earth movements that changed history, voices that once rose against empires. He played recordings of speeches from leaders who had stood alone at first, then with many whose words had not been swords, but still cut through stone. Lyra listened every day, writing notes in a language she was building on her own, mixing his words with hers, shaping something new, something hers. Then came the moment he knew was coming, the day she arrived with a bruise under one eye, not fresh but dark and low and quiet. When she saw his face tighten, she shook her head and said, "No, it was not the elders. It was one of the boys who saw me using your tool. He said I was becoming dangerous." Ray clenched his fists, then opened them. Slowly he asked her if she still wanted to learn, and without hesitating, she said, "Yes, I will not stop. They already fear me. I want to be worth their fear." He gave her an idea, something bold, something dangerous but necessary, a way to speak to many at once without being seen. He showed her how to record a message on the device, how to pair it with the audio nodes around the village center, how to set a timer, how to let her voice echo in the place where she was never allowed to speak. She practiced her words again and again, rewriting them until they sounded like fire. Then one night she left quietly, and when she returned, her hands were shaking, but her eyes were brighter than ever. She said, "It is done. When the sun rises, they will hear." Mary barely slept that night. He stood outside the ship, staring at the stars, wondering what would happen, what risk he had helped create, and if it would bring change or punishment, or both. At dawn, the village awoke to a sound they had never heard, a girl's voice, loud and clear, filling every corner of the square. Lyra's voice, calm but fierce, spoke truths they had never allowed. She said, "We are not less. We are not weak. Our silence was never agreement. We have minds, we have hearts, we can speak, we can walk, we can rise." Village fell into chaos. Some shouted, some cried, some ran, but no one could unhear her words. No one could deny the strength of a voice that had never been allowed before. And when Ray checked the monitors, he saw something else: two girls stepping out of huts, not kneeling women, standing with heads high, boys looking confused, uncertain, maybe even ashamed. The elders gathered quickly, trying to stop the broadcast, but it was too late. The words had been heard, the silence was broken, and Lyra stood on the hill above the village, watching with a face like stone, like wind, like a storm ready to come. Ray walked to her side and said, "They heard you." And she said, "I know I was never taught to stand, but I am standing now, and I will never kneel again." And in that moment, Ray knew no matter what came next, this was no longer just one girl against tradition. This was the first crack in a wall built over generations, and cracks always grow. The sun had barely lifted above the hilltops, but the village below was already alive with noise. The message Lyra had recorded was still ringing in there. Ears, even though the voice had fallen silent, her words now traveled through mouths. Not machines repeated by those who had heard them and could not forget them. The elders had gathered, quickly speaking with sharp hands and harder voices their faces. Pulled tight by fear, masked as anger, they sent their watchers through the homes trying to find the source of the voice. But none pointed at Lyra. She stayed away from the center that morning, sitting near the edge of the village watching from the shadow of the rocks, her heart pounding in her chest, not with fear, but with something sharper, something that felt like strength grown from fire. She saw girls move faster when the watchers passed, but they no longer bowed their heads fully, not the way they used to. She saw one girl pause near the square, looking up at the great stone that held the village symbols. The place where no woman ever touched her hand rose for a moment before she turned away, but the movement was real. It was the beginning of something waiting to break. Ray saw it too from the high ridge where his ship sat. His lenses zoomed into the village, and what he witnessed made him speak softly to himself. The system was shaking, not from war, not from invasion, but from a girl who chose not to kneel anymore. He checked the sensors, the communicator, and the recorder, everything still running. He knew the higher command would see the feed eventually, and he knew the decision he had made was not one he could take back. Now Lyra returned that evening, her steps slow, her face calm, but her eyes told another story. She said, "They are searching for the voice, but I did not answer. They punished one of the boys who spoke in my defense. He is hurt, but not broken." He told them many would speak if they were not afraid. She sat beside Ray under the open sky, her fingers resting on the soft earth, her breath steady. She said, "I do not want them to hurt others. I only wanted them to hear." Mary said, "They did hear you, and now they will try to silence you, but you are not alone anymore. Others heard you too, and they will not forget. Even if you are silent again, your words are in them now." Lyra looked up and asked if he had ever been afraid to speak, and Ray told her the truth, that yes, he had been afraid many times, but the fear was not what mattered. It was what he did despite the fear that made the difference. They worked together through the night, planning ways to reach more people, not through machines this time, but through stories and signs, through songs that carried meaning, even without direct challenge. Lyra suggested they write messages on the stones near the river where the young ones gathered at dusk. Ray helped her craft symbols, easy to carve, easy to remember. He showed her how to use soft light ink that glowed faintly under starlight, but faded by morning, so only those who knew where to look could see them. The next few days passed in a strange rhythm. The village tried to return to silence, but something had changed under the surface. Girls looked each other in the eyes more often. They shared small smiles, brief touches of hands. Boys began to ask questions, not loudly, not in front of elders, but quietly in places where only truth could live. One night, a fire was started near the food hall, not a wild fire, but one set on purpose, a warning. The elders blamed unknown rebels. They said outside hands were corrupting their traditions, but no one confessed, and no one betrayed the others. Ray received a message from orbit. His actions had been reviewed and flagged. He was ordered to prepare for removal within 5 rotations. The penalty for cultural interference was clear, but he felt no regret. He had come to observe, and instead had become a witness to the rise of something rare, something human, not in blood, but in spirit, the ability to stand and say enough. When he told Lyra about the order, she asked if he would be punished. He said maybe, but it would be worth it. She said, "I wish I could go with you, see your sky, your snow, your mountains." And he looked at her and said, "One day maybe, but for now this is your mountain, and you are climbing it with every step you take." That evening Lyra did not go back to the village. She stayed near the ship, and Ray gave her a small space to rest inside. She slept curled like a child, but her face was calm, and in her sleep she whispered names he did not know, maybe names of those she had lost, maybe of her sister, maybe of the self she was still trying to become. Before dawn, she rose and left a small bundle by his chair, a woven band with her name stitched in their shared language. A gift not of goodbye, but of thanks. She returned to her village, quietly ready to face what waited. And when the elders called for a gathering at midday, She stepped forward before they could even speak. She did not shout, she did not bow, she only raised her voice enough for all to hear and said, I am not your enemy. I am your sister. I am your daughter. I am not fire to burn your ways. I am light to show a path forward. You can punish me or you can hear me, but I will not kneel again. The crowd did not move at first, but then from the back a small voice said, I hear you, and then another said, so do I, and then more joined until the space was filled with voices not loud, not wild, just steady and strong. The elders stood frozen, their rules breaking like thin glass under too much pressure. They tried to speak, but their words fell into a sea that had already begun to rise. Ray watched from above the signal from his ship, capturing everything. He recorded it, not for his report, but for memory, for history, for proof that change can begin with one voice, one girl, one truth spoken where dared before. Last thing he saw that day before the clouds rolled in was Lyra standing in the center of her people, eyes lifted not to the sky but forward toward something still invisible but waiting. Wind had changed since the day of her speech, not in strength or temperature, but in feeling. The breeze now carried whispers, not commands, not fear, but names and thoughts and questions that had never been spoken aloud before. The village no longer sounded the same. Footsteps carried more weight. Children laughed more freely. Women moved without always looking over their shoulders. Something had broken in the silence, and something new was being built from inside the cracks. Lyra did not return to hiding. She walked each day through the village square, through the narrow paths, through the market where the stairs had once made her shrink. She did not avoid them now. Some eyes still held anger, some still held fear, but others held wonder, others held respect, and some even held hope, the kind that rises when someone dares to speak the truth first. She no longer carried the learning device, but she no longer needed it. Her voice had become the message, her presence was the symbol, and the words she had once whispered now lived on the lips of others. Sometimes changed, sometimes sung, sometimes drawn on small stones hidden under baskets, or marked onto the backs of hands. Ray watched her from the ship, his departure deadline nearing. Each day he adjusted the systems, cleaned the sensors, completed the logs. Not because he wanted to go, but because the call had come, and he could not ignore it much longer. Still, he knew his leaving would not be the end. It would be a moment like any other, and moments pass but change stays. The final message from command arrived with cold clarity. Removal required due to protocol violation. No appeal allowed. Replacement unit inbound within one rotation. He read the words slowly, knowing each one carried the weight of an ending. He had started this mission alone, expected nothing beyond a routine report, and now he was walking away from something he could never fully explain to those who had never seen it. That evening, he met Lyra near the tall stones, just beyond the eastern slope, where her people once came for ritual blessings. Now they came for learning. He found her kneeling, not in submission, but in focus, carving new symbols onto the smooth face of the rock, using the sharpened bone dipped in glowing ink. When she saw him, she stood and smiled, and he knew. She already understood what his presence there meant. She said, they sent for you, and he nodded. She said, you must leave soon, and he said yes, and she said, I am not sad, and he believed her, not because she would not miss him, but because she had learned how to walk alone, and that was what mattered more. He handed her a small cube, no bigger than her palm, a learning archive, filled with all his lessons, all the stories, all the voices of Earth's long road to change and freedom. She turned it in her hands, eyes wide. He said, this is yours now. Teach them, build with it, grow with it, forget nothing. She said, I will. And then she stepped closer and said, I have something for you too. She placed a thin thread of woven bark into his hand, and he saw symbols stitched into it, not her name this time, but the word they had created together for freedom. Not a direct translation, but a sound full of wind and stone and flame and sky. When the time came for departure, Lyra stood beside his ship. Others had gathered near the rocks, not close, not touching, but watching, not with fear, not with suspicion, just with quiet thought, the kind that grows into courage. Ray climbed the ramp, paused at the top, looked back once and said, one last thing, you never had to kneel, Lyra, but you did, and then you stood, and that is what made all the Difference, the ship rose slowly, lifting above. The red dust, the wind catching the edges of his departure, but not pulling at what had already taken root below. The engines did not roar, they hummed steady, like a heart strong but calm, and in that final moment before the clouds swallowed him from view, he saw Lyra raise her hand, not to wave, not to worship, but to signal her path was clear above the planet. Ray stared out the window long after the stars had returned to view. He set the recording files to save a copy for the Earth archives, another for the deep language banks, and one encrypted file meant only for her, when she would one day be able to open it, a message of memory and pride and faith back. In the village, Lyra did not stop walking. She did not stop speaking. She gathered the girls, and even some boys, and began teaching beneath the old trees, using the stories he had given her. She sang songs of the stars, but she also spoke of truth, of kindness, of voices that once hid in fear, but now stood in the sun. The elders no longer held the same power, not because they had been removed, but because their power no longer came from obedience. It had come from silence, and that silence was gone. Seasons passed, and more villages began to send quiet messengers to learn from Lyra. They brought questions, not weapons. They brought girls who wanted to write, and boys who wanted to unlearn the old ways. They carried no banners, they started no wars, but every step they took was a rebellion against a world that had said be still, and they chose to move. Lyra grew in voice and wisdom, never claiming a title, never seeking rule. She only spoke, she only listened, she only reminded them that standing was the first thing they had forgotten, and the first thing they must remember again. Her people would tell stories of her for years, not stories of magic or battle, but of a girl who once walked into the village square with fear in her hands, and walked out with fire in her eyes, who once heard a voice from the sky say you do not have to kneel, and instead of just believing it, chose to live it, and in doing so taught others to rise. Ray never returned, but his name became part of their history, not as a hero, not as a savior, but as a mirror, someone who showed them what they already held inside and left when they were ready to see it for themselves. In the end, it was never about the sky or the stars or the ship that came from beyond the clouds. It was about a voice that dared to speak, and a people who chose to listen, and a girl who learned not just how to stand, but how to help others rise with her. The end.